I never expected company that winter, let alone the kind that would change the rest of my life. By then I was a man hollowed out, living only because my body hadn't yet given up. 45 years behind me, 3 of them without Marjorie. I'd buried her under the cottonwood by the creek, the same one she used to plant flowers around. They never bloomed again after she died. Since then, I spoke to no one unless I had to. I fixed fences, mended saddles, traded once a month in town, then returned to my silence. Folks whispered about me. Some said I'd gone mad from grief. Some said I'd always been that way. Maybe both were true. All I knew was that my cabin had become a tomb I kept breathing in. That night, the snow was heavy enough to smother sound. I just sat down near the fire when I heard something, faint, halting, like a wounded coyote. My hand went for the shotgun out of habit more than fear. When I stepped outside, I saw her. She lay in the drift under the cedar, curled up small, her dress torn and her arm bloodied from shoulder to wrist. Barefoot, barely alive. I froze there longer than I should have, just staring, not believing. Then I lowered the gun and carried her in. She weighed less than sorrow itself, smelled of river water and smoke. I laid her by the fire, wrapped her in the only blanket that didn't belong to Marjorie, and stitched her wound with the same hands that once worked as a medic in the war. She flinched once at the needle, but never cried out. Her lips moved in words I didn't understand, but I felt them all the same. Comanche, I thought. I should have left her there. That's what I told myself. But when dawn came, she was still in my cabin, alive. Her eyes opened with fear sharp as a blade. I'd left her bread and jerky. She reached for it like a cornered animal. I told her only one thing. You're safe here. For now. She didn't answer, but she didn't run either. And that silence between us, it was the first time in years it hadn't felt like morning. The storm thickened that day, the kind of snow that swallows the prairie whole. I kept busy outside, breaking ice in the troughs, checking fences, doing the kind of chores that keep a man from thinking too much. When I came back inside, she'd swept the hearth and folded the blanket. I noticed the way her eyes kept darting toward the cupboard. Hunger makes its own language, and hers was plain. So I cooked stew that night. Pork, beans, a bit of wild onion. She ate it slow, careful, like every bite was a ceremony. I pretended not to see how one side of her face stayed still when she chewed. Someone had struck her, hard. I didn't ask. She didn't tell. That night, I gave her the bed and I took the chair by the fire. Not out of kindness, I told myself, but practicality. She was healing. That was all. But sometime in the dark I woke and saw her standing at the window, her silhouette framed in firelight, her eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for something or someone. You expecting trouble? I asked. She looked at me then. For a long moment, she studied me like a gambler weighing his last coin. And finally, she nodded once. I'd known trouble in every shape. War, hunger, loss. But this was different. This wasn't my trouble. Yet somehow, it was already inside my home. I pulled another blanket from the chair and handed it to her. You'll stay tonight. We'll figure the rest in the morning. Her eyes softened, just slightly. Not trust. Not yet. But not fear either. When dawn broke, I went to feed the horses, only to find the ground scarred with fresh tracks. Dozens of hoofprints circling the cabin like a noose. I followed them to the ridge, and that's when I saw them. Riders. Dozens, 60, 70 maybe. Comanche. Their spears caught the sun, their faces painted, silent as shadows. At their head was a man cloaked in wolf fur, his expression carved from stone. When I turned back, she was at the fire. Her face was pale, but not surprised. Her lips parted just enough for one word. Father. And the silence that followed told me exactly what I'd brought into my house. The riders fanned out slow, deliberate, circling my land like wolves testing a pen. Their hooves made hardly a sound in the snow. The one in wolf fur, her father, I realized, sat tall and still in his saddle, his gaze fixed not on her, but on me. I didn't reach for the Winchester over the door. My hand touched it, then dropped. There wasn't a bullet in the world that would help me against 70 Comanche. So I walked out into the cold and stood there with nothing but my breath hanging in the air. The girl stepped forward before I could speak. Father, she said, steady as stone. The man dismounted, the snow crunching beneath his boots like a prayer breaking. He looked at me, then at her. His voice came low, like thunder before the storm. You sheltered her. It wasn't a question. I nodded once. She crossed into death, he said, his eyes hard as flint. And you gave her breath again. I didn't give her anything, I answered. She took it back herself. The girl stepped between us. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. I did not run from you. I ran from men who took more than they had a right to. A murmur rippled through the warriors, but none moved. Her father studied me for a long time, searching my face as if weighing whether to end me where I stood. Then he spoke again, softer but sharper. My warriors will not strike today, but they may return. You have 3 days. Then I come not as father, but as chief. He mounted with one fluid motion, gave no command, yet the circle of riders moved as one, turning like a tide pulled back into the horizon. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving nothing but churned snow and the echo of hooves. When I went back inside, the cabin felt colder than it had all winter. She sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes unreadable. I told her the truth, plain and simple. You should go with them. Her jaw tightened. And go where? Back to silence. To a marriage I did not choose. You gave me a room that didn't lock. I didn't answer. I busied myself with the fire, though it didn't need tending. My hands shook with the weight of what her father had left behind. 3 days. That was the line he drew. 3 grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. And I knew that when the last fell, my life, or hers, would never be the same. The first day after they left, the land felt wrong. Too still. The sky hung gray and heavy, the kind that presses down on a man's chest like a weight. I threw myself into chores to quiet my thoughts, feeding the horse, mending wire, chopping wood that didn't need chopping. But no matter what I did, the shadow of those hoofprints in the snow lingered at the edge of my vision. She moved through my cabin like a ghost turned flesh. Never asked permission, never asked forgiveness. She swept the hearth, folded blankets, even restocked the woodpile after dusk. When silence stretched too long, she broke it in her own way. She asked me my wife's name. I hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Marjorie, I said, quiet as falling snow. She didn't say another word. But later, I found Marjorie's old shawl, the one still hanging over the chair, folded carefully at the foot of the bed. She'd taken it down like she understood what it meant to me. That gesture landed heavier than any sentence. I began watching her differently after that. Not with hunger, not with pity, just a steady curiosity that unsettled me. She was younger than the weight in her eyes suggested, but there was nothing soft about her. She carried storms inside her silence. One morning I caught her crouched by the coop, feeding biscuit scraps to a hen that had once bloodied my hand. The bird ate from her palm gentle as a child. She looked up at me and smiled faintly, not the kind that lights a face, but one that said she had her own way with the world. That night, I left a strip of blue cloth I'd bought in town on the table. She ran her fingers over it slow, reverent. By morning she was stitching it into a tunic with hands precise as any machine. Watching her, I realized I hadn't truly seen another person in years. The second night, as the wind screamed across the prairie, she sang. A low lullaby in Comanche, not for me, but for herself. I didn't understand the words, and I didn't ask. Some things weren't meant for translation. I just listened, and for the first time since Marjorie's death, the silence inside me shifted. But still, the hourglass bled sand. 2 days remained. 2 breaths between peace and blood. And every glance at her made me wonder which side of that line she'd stand on when it ran out. On the second morning, I rode into town for supplies. It was foolish, maybe reckless, but I needed to keep busy, to buy food and fabric, anything that kept my hands moving. Folks in town don't miss much, especially not when a man like me lingers too long. Miss Lahi at the store narrowed her eyes the moment I asked for an extra tin cup. "You've got company, Sam?" she asked. I kept my voice even. "Someone passing through." Her mouth pinched. "Company's not always good company. She's not trouble, is she?" When I didn't answer, she leaned closer, whispering like the word itself was poison. "A Comanche girl?" I said nothing, just laid down my coin. But her look followed me all the way out the door. Back at the cabin, she was stitching again, the firelight catching her needle as it rose and fell. Her eyes flicked off into the window. She didn't need to say it. She was waiting, expecting them. That evening she cooked broth with the supplies I'd brought. For the first time, we ate together not as strangers trying to survive, but as something closer to kin. Afterward she stood near the window, her face lit in amber glow. "I dreamed of a river," she said. My mother washed my hair in the shallows. I hadn't thought of her in years. I asked softly, she gone? She nodded. Sick in the winter. No medicine. I swallowed hard. There were no words worth speaking. Then she said something that cut deeper than any blade. You remind me of her. You listen the way she did. Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read. I had no answer. I just stood by the fire, letting her words carve me open. The next day, I showed her how to shape rawhide into reins. She showed me a knot used to bind arrow shafts. We worked side by side, the cold wind weaving between us, and for a moment it felt like building something instead of just waiting for it to be taken away. That night, she braided my horse's mane, humming under her breath. When our eyes met, she smiled. Just barely, but enough to undo something that had been locked in me for years. Later, by the fire, she leaned her head against the arm of my chair. I didn't move away. Outside, the prairie was scarred by the memory of 70 horses. Inside, two shadows leaned into each other, stitched together by firelight and silence. And for the first time, I wanted more than just to survive the 3 days her father had given me. I wanted her to stay. The third morning came, and with it a sky the color of ash. The prairie felt stretched too tight, as though one wrong breath might snap it in two. I stood on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the horizon. I didn't need to guess anymore. They were coming. Inside, she braided her hair tight, bound her arm with fresh cloth, and moved with the calm of someone who had already made her choice. She didn't dress like a girl waiting to be rescued. She dressed like someone bracing for battle, even if that battle had no weapons. We sat together at the table, the fire popping behind us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "They will want me to return. Not just because I am daughter to a chief, but because I left without permission. They see me as belonging." "You don't belong to anyone," I told her. Her eyes found mine, steady, unwavering. "That is not how they see it. A woman sheltered is a woman claimed. They won't ask why you helped me. They'll assume they already know." I looked at my hands, scarred and calloused. "Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them," I said, though I had no idea how. She reached across the table, her fingers warm against mine. That touch was stronger than any vow. By noon, the earth itself began to rumble. Not thunder from the sky, hooves. I left my rifle by the door. This wasn't a fight bullets could win. The Comanche came in a line this time, not a circle. A wall of painted faces and horses, the kind of sight that turns a man's blood cold. At the center was her father, Chief Navo, broad-shouldered under his wolf pelt, eyes sharp as flint. He raised his hand, and the riders dismounted in unison. Still no weapons drawn, but the air felt thick enough to choke. "You've had your days," Navo said, his voice low but heavy. "Now she returns." "She is not property," I answered. "She is daughter," he said back, fire in his eyes. "That is not ownership. That is bond. When a bond is broken, something dies." Then she stepped forward. Her voice cut clean, steady as a blade. "Then let it die, if it was built on silence." A murmur rippled through the warriors. The air shifted. The storm had arrived. Her father's jaw tightened at her words. He stepped closer, eyes burning into her. "You speak like one who forgets blood." She didn't move. "I speak like one who has seen what happens when blood is all that binds." Then his gaze shifted to me, and the weight of it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. "You would keep her? A man who knows nothing of our ways, who cannot speak to our dead." I swallowed hard, but I didn't look away. "I would keep her only if she wanted to stay. I've lost everything I loved already. I won't hold her by force." The silence that followed could have broken the earth in two. The warriors stood rigid, their faces unreadable. Her father's hand went to his belt, and I thought the end had come. But instead of steel for killing, he drew a blade etched with old carvings, ceremonial, sacred. He held it out to me. "A man does not win a daughter," he said. "He proves whether he will break under her weight or carry it with honor. Hunt with me. One deer, one path. If you walk it true, I will know the kind of man you are." I hesitated, but not for long. She touched my hand as I turned to go, her grip steady, not pleading, just present. That was enough. We rode into the low hills, chief and widower, silence between us heavier than war. When we found the buck, its ears twitching, eyes wide, Navo handed me the bow. The same bow she had strung days earlier. I moved slow, careful, the way I once had in battlefields long ago. I drew, loosed, and the arrow struck clean behind the shoulder. The deer fell, swift and sure. We carried it back in silence. Rain had begun to fall, not hard but steady, like something the earth had been holding back too long. The warriors watched as we returned, their faces still as stone. Navo looked at me for a long time, then turned to her. His voice was rough, but it did not shake. You are no longer of my fire, but you are not gone from my heart. He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then mounted his horse. The riders followed, their silence deeper than thunder. No blood spilled, no blade drawn, just departure. And when the sound of hooves faded, all that remained was the rain, and her hand finding mine in the quiet. The storm that followed wasn't made of steel or blood. It was made of whispers. We rode into town together a few days later, side by side, and every eye followed us. Miss Lahi stood in her doorway, arms crossed, mouth tight. You brought her back then, she said. She's not cargo, I answered. Nahili stepped forward before I could say more. I am not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose. Her voice cut through the hush like a blade, and though Lahi bristled, she stepped aside. Inside the store, every breath turned heavy as we filled our sacks with flour, sugar, coffee. At the counter, I spoke the words that set the whole town buzzing. We'll be married come spring. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't defiance. It was simply the truth. She didn't flinch. She walked out with her head high, leaving behind the scent of sage from the pouch at her belt. Back at the cabin, the air felt different. No longer a tomb, no longer waiting for storm or siege. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. She spread Marjorie's shawl on the bed, now stitched with a strip of blue cloth she'd sewn in herself. Past and present woven together. Weeks turned into months. She carved antler and bone. I built fences and mended saddles. She taught me to track rabbits. I taught her to shoot. The silence between us changed. It was no longer survival, but language. A rhythm we shared. One evening I sat carving a cradle, slow and careful, the way I had once for a child who never drew breath. She leaned in the doorway, one hand cradling the small curve of her belly. Her eyes held something soft, something unbroken. You're different, she said. Maybe because I don't carry it alone anymore, I answered. She crossed the room and placed her hands on my face. You never told me what you wanted. I looked into her dark eyes, steady as the prairie sky. I wanted peace. I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door. She kissed me then, not tentative, not desperate. A kiss that anchored instead of burned. A kiss that said we had survived the storms and would weather more together. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and endless. The hoofprints of 70 warriors had long since washed away in the rain. But their mark remained, carved not in snow but in the life we had built, quiet and stubborn, beneath the cedar tree that once bore sorrow and now bore hope. Some stories begin with fire, some with ash. Ours began the night I opened my door to her, and she chose to walk in.